synadelphi ke fidites. Ime ibon Westcote, the epthentriatis Americanikis scholis classicon spudons din Athena. Ke ine haramu pusas kalos orizo edo opopse, yatin telef teamas, earini dialexi yaton classico cosmo. Kalos orizo episis, olisasas, pumas paracolithite, diadictia ka. I omilitiamas apopse, I Bronwen Wickkiser, ine mia axiologi epistimonas ke kathigithria, ke imaste tikari pu fetos ine diakekrimeni ipotropos to Whitehead, stin Americaniki scoli. Ine I proti pu katheki tin edratis kathigitrias, stin archaea historia Solomon Bloom, sto timima classicon ke anatolikon spudon, sto collegio Hunter, tis neas Yorkis. Prin entakthi sto programma classicon spudon to Hunter, I kathigithrio Wickkiser, didaske sto collegio Wabash, stin Indiana. To ergo tis Bronwen, diarevna tis skesis metaxi, thriskias ke igionomikis perithalpsis ston archeo cosmo. To thema ine exeretica epigon, kathos mirazomaste poles apotis idies anisikies sketica metin evimeria opus ke I anthropi stin archeotita. I Bronwen ekphrasis stin epistemi ke stin didaskaliatis mia prothemia na geferosi ke na syndesi epistimonicus cladus. Episis senevele stin enarxi to Anthony Fauci Award in STEM and Classics pu prosferi I classici enosi tis messis thesis ke to notu. Opopse mirazete mazimas to ergotis yaton iatrico turismo ston archeo cosmo. Ekondas os fetiria mia pragmatia tu galinu pu anacalithike prosfata. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, students and friends. I am Bronwen Wickkiser, Director of the American School of Classical Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the last lecture in our spring series on the classical world. I also welcome those of you who are following us online. Our speaker this evening, Bronwen Wickkiser, is an excellent scholar and much admired teacher, and it is our very good fortune that she has been a Whitehead Distinguished Scholar here this year. She is the inaugural Solomon Bloom Professor of Ancient History in the Department of Classical and Oriental Studies at Hunter College in New York. Before joining the Classical Studies program at Hunter, Professor Wickkiser taught at Wabash College in Indiana. Now, Bronwen Wickkiser's work explores the intersections between religion and healthcare in the ancient world. The topic is one of great urgency, as we share many of the same concerns regarding well-being as did people in antiquity. Bronwen models in her scholarship and teaching a willingness to build bridges and connect disciplines. To this end, she has helped to launch the Anthony Fauci Award in STEM and Classics, offered by the Classical Association of the Middle West and South, otherwise known as CAMWIS. This evening, she shares with us her work on medical tourism in the ancient world, taking a recently discovered treatise by Galen on avoiding distress as her point of departure. Since we all want to avoid distress, I turn the floor over to Bronwen immediately.
I'm a little vertically challenged, so there's a platform that has been pushed into place. Thank you, Bana, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for attending this lecture. I want to begin by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to everyone who has made this past year at the American School memorable and productive, from the Greek community who welcomes all of us here at the American School to the entire staff of this institution. Because of you, my work is not only possible, but pleasurable. I also want to thank members of the academic staff, in particular Brendan Burke, Mellon Professor, and Lou Ruprecht, Whitehead Scholar, for their generosity and insights from the Bronze Age to Byron and beyond. And I also want to thank the students here at the school, all of you. It's heartening to engage with the future of classics, and I should say more broadly of Greek studies, and that future looks bright indeed. So let's begin this evening by looking at a monument, a grave stele for a ship's captain who visited the healing baths of Heracles at Edipsos. The monument dates roughly from the 4th to 6th centuries CE, and as you can see is inscribed with both a text in Greek and the image of a ship. I'll return to the text in a moment. To get us oriented, Edipsos lies towards the northwest of the island of Euboea. The baths here were famous in antiquity. We know from Plutarch, for instance, that the Roman general Sulla visited while suffering from gout. Note that he also made a vacation of the visit at the same time. These baths at Edipsos would remain popular. By the early 20th century, a large spa complex had been constructed, the Termae Scylla, named in honor of the Roman general. And many people, including celebrities and politicians, would come to take the baths. Among them was another famous statesman, Winston Churchill. Now, somewhere between the visits of Sulla and Churchill, closer to the time of Sulla, came a man named Diogenianos. I'll read here a translation of the inscription. Here I lie, Diogenianos of Nicomedia. Before I was the friend of many, but now I have gone down to Hades. Before I sailed as captain to many places, but now as navigator I remain to bathe at the thermal springs of Edipsos. Thus bitter fate spun it out that I bathe by the road. And through this grave marker of mine, I remind passers-by, acquire and make use while you are still alive. And if you like to read Greek, lines 19 and 20, I'm just struck by these three monosyllabic words, zone, kto, kro, acquire and make use while you are still alive, because everyone is fated to die. Well, it's hard to overlook the amount of lament in this man's epitaph. But for the purposes of my talk tonight, what is striking is the distance that this man traveled. He's from the Roman province of Bithynia on the northern coast of Asia Minor. Whether he sailed to Euboea for the purposes of taking the baths, or if he happened to be in the area on other business and decided to visit Edipsos, is a question that we cannot answer. But he did travel a long distance ultimately, and he sought therapy. Thus, we might construe this as an instance of what today is called medical tourism, and this is the topic of my talk. So what I'd like to do this evening is first offer a brief overview of medical tourism as a phenomenon in our world today, including here in Greece. Then we'll take a look at a recently rediscovered treatise by the 2nd century physician Galen. The title in Greek is Perialoupias, which we might translate as On Avoiding Distress. This text sheds a lot of light on medical tourism broadly construed in the Greco-Roman world. Finally, we'll take a couple of quick detours with Dr. Galen as our guide to look at two particular medicinal substances and the distances that they traveled in the Greco-Roman medical marketplace, a marketplace that extended well beyond the Mediterranean. Well, let's start with medical tourism today. Generally, what the phrase medical tourism implies is travel by an individual beyond their hometown for the purposes of seeking health care. Medical tourism is a booming global industry, and there are many reasons why people travel for medical attention. These include access to healthcare. A procedure may not be available or legal in one's hometown, or the waiting period might be quite long. Another is cost of healthcare. In some places, therapies cost less, sometimes a lot less. And finally, quality of healthcare. Some areas of the globe specialize in certain procedures. And there is a growing body of scholarship on medical tourism in our world today. I chose this particular book because of its cover art, the imaginative passport stamps pointing to local specializations. Bulgaria for in vitro fertilization, South Korea for plastic surgery, Israel for bone marrow transplants, and so on. Well, Greece is no exception to this trend in medical tourism. According to a recent study, Greece ranked 25th in the global medical tourism market in 2019. That number almost certainly has climbed since and will only continue to climb with efforts of organizations like Detours, a Greek health tourism council. And here you can see that in addition to the reasons I've already listed for patients traveling, comes the promise of beautiful surroundings here in Greece in which to recover from whatever procedure you undergo, which is a bit reminiscent of Sulla's decision not only to take the baths at Edipsos, but to make a holiday of it. There are efforts also by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation to make quality healthcare more accessible under the aegis of its global health initiative. This includes construction of 3 new hospitals in Greece, a pediatric hospital in Thessaloniki, and general hospitals in Sparta and Komotini. The Niarchos Foundation promises that these will be immersed in nature, including in at least one instance a sensory park, gardens, and trees that together reinforce the relationship between the buildings and natural environment, thereby improving clinical outcomes. Whether or not these new hospitals are intended to serve global tourists, it seems inevitable that they will only raise Greece's profile within the health tourism industry. Well, as we've already begun to see, medical tourism has roots in Greek and Roman antiquity. Sulla traveled seeking a cure for gout, and the link between environment and health articulated by the Niarchos Foundation echoes ideas expressed as early as the Hippocratic corpus. And so, inspired by this material, I offered a seminar on medical tourism in the Greco-Roman world here at the American School this year to a wonderful cohort of graduate students. I thank them and all the members of the school for the many great conversations and relevant data they shared with me. This past year has been an unparalleled opportunity to travel around Greece with the idea of medical tourism in mind. Now, as to my larger project, which is still at an early stage, I am determining parameters. I will want to consider, of course, the experience of patients who traveled for healthcare, which, as we've heard, is the essence of medical tourism today. My earlier work on healing cults prepares me well for this, and there is a good amount of data for it. But for this project, I want to think about medical tourism more broadly than just patients who traveled. I want to think about other people and objects and ideas that moved far and wide across the Mediterranean in the service of healthcare. This means that I want to consider also practitioners, many of whom traveled, whether to learn how to heal or to dispense healthcare. There's abundant evidence for this phenomenon from Homer onward. In the Odyssey, for instance, physicians are listed alongside prophets, carpenters, and poets as people summoned across the boundless earth for their skills that benefit the community. And on a tombstone from the 1st century CE in Rome, we see in the final line of the inscription that a certain Sosicrates, son of Sosicrates, had come all the way from Nicaea, which is also in the province of Bithynia, and that this Sosicrates was a medicus, or physician. Perhaps he tended to the household of the 2 freed persons mentioned above in the inscription. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that all health practitioners traveled, certainly not, but a good number of them did, as we find often in literary and especially in the epigraphic record. In my project, moreover, I want to think about the trade in medical knowledge and materia medica, the stuff of medicine, drugs, instruments, and the like. One example of a drug is Lemnian soil, a highly prized medicinal earth from the northern Aegean island of Lemnos. Many ancient writers talk about its therapeutic effects, including Pliny, Galen, and Dioscorides, the latter a first-century physician. You see here a beautifully illustrated manuscript of an Arabic translation of his text. What we learn from these sources is that Lemnian soil was harvested in rituals that included moistening the earth with water and forming it into roundels or pills. The Greek word is sphragides. These would often also be stamped with some kind of image, and then were dried in the sun. These pills would either be ingested into the body, like we take a pill today, or reconstituted with water or wine and spread like a plaster on the surface of the skin. Its pill form meant that Lemnian soil was an especially portable and durable object, one that could be traded, stored, and consumed easily. And it would remain popular for centuries. It was still being harvested in religious rituals in the 19th century. So we'll come back to the topic of materia medica like this shortly, since a good part of Galen's treatise deals with it. Finally, and I won't discuss this tonight, but for my larger project, I want to lean into the word tourism to think about medicine as spectacle. For instance, there are many works of art that represent medical procedures in sometimes graphic detail, such as this wall painting from Pompeii showing the physician Iapix treating a wound suffered by Aeneas, which is a scene described also in Book 12 of Virgil's Aeneid. And what you see here is Iapix using forceps to try to extract an arrowhead lodged in Aeneas's thigh. And according to Virgil, he won't be successful on his own. He will need the help of a botanical, a plant, dictamos or dittany, that Aeneas's mother, the goddess Venus, has to fetch all the way from Crete and bring back to Italy to heal Aeneas. And you see Venus in the background. She's the one above Iapix. And if you look carefully in her left hand, she's holding a plant. So it would seem that this visual representation maps on pretty closely to Virgil's description. And by the way, that getting of the plant from Crete is another example of materia medica traveling across the Mediterranean. But what is especially salient regarding this painting, as I see it, is where it was located. It decorated a triclinium, a place where people would eat and drink. This is not an isolated instance. We have symposium cups, for instance, that also depict medical procedures. So clearly, there was an appetite for this kind of medical spectacle. Not too different, I submit, from our own interest in medical dramas. In the United States, one of these medical dramas, a television show called Grey's Anatomy, has just begun airing its 20th season. We too consume healthcare as spectacle. Well, as I say tonight, I'll leave this aside to linger instead over the exchange in materia medica and medical knowledge as described by the physician Galen. I am sure all of you have some knowledge of Galen, but let me refresh your memories about his life and work. I should emphasize that most of what we know about Galen comes from Galen himself, from his own writings. He wrote a lot. Well over 100 of his texts survive, and we know of many more. Some we know only from translations into Latin, Hebrew, Syriac, and Arabic. Regarding his texts that survive in Greek, they together comprise, by some estimates, 1/10 of all surviving Greek literature from Homer through the end of the 2nd century. 1/10. The more conservative estimate is 1/8. So, as I say, he wrote a lot. Regarding Galen's own life, he tells us that he was born in Pergamon in the Roman province of Asia. He was the son of an architect, but under the guidance of a divine dream, he studied instead medicine and philosophy intensively with teachers not only in Pergamon, but also Ephesus, Smyrna, and Alexandria. So here we find already in Galen's Vita evidence for travel to study medicine, and he talks about other students who traveled for this reason as well. After his studies, Galen returned to Pergamon, where he spent at least 4 years as physician to a gladiatorial school. Here, he would come into contact many times with human anatomy in ways that most physicians never did. because there were taboos against dissecting human corpses. So as a result, direct knowledge of human anatomy came mostly from chance encounters with bodies opened through violence, such as military engagements and gladiatorial combat. Human anatomy could also be ascertained indirectly and sometimes incorrectly from dissections and vivisections of animals. Indeed, Galen won his position a physician to the gladiators through an anatomical demonstration before an audience that included some physicians, in front of whom he disemboweled a living monkey. He pulled out its intestines while the monkey was screeching, writhing, and I imagine bleeding profusely, and challenged the physicians to come forward, replace the intestines in the abdominal cavity, and suture it up before the monkey died. No one accepted the challenge. But Galen assures us that he successfully completed the procedure. Galen is not a shy, retiring man. This is just another example, by the way, of the kind of medical spectacle I'm interested in. Galen talks about many anatomical demonstrations that he and others made in front of crowds, large and small, many of them populated by interested laypersons, so not just physicians, whether on street corners, in houses and theaters, or even next to temples. Many demonstrations of this sort that Galen describes took place in Rome, the city to which Galen moved at the age of 32. Looking at this map, you might imagine that Galen sailed from Pergamon to Rome, but there is evidence that he walked much of the way, a good portion of it along the Roman road called the Via Egnatia, which you can see in the red line in the map. The photo on the right was taken this past fall on the first stop of our very first school trip at a section of the Via Egnatia near Kavala. And we had been on the bus for a very long time by this point, I think 13 hours by this point. We had a long detour because of all the damage done because of the flooding at the beginning of September. So I think we were all very grateful to stand on this beautiful stretch of the Via Egnatia. By the way, I should say it's details like this, how Galen gets around, and there's a lot of evidence for this in his writings. These things excite me. If you haven't dipped into the corpus of Galen, you might assume that his texts are laden with dense discussion of medicine and philosophy, and you will find that, to be sure. But there is also a trove of fascinating information about everyday life, and I'll try to highlight some of that for you this evening. Well, Galen would spend most of the rest of his life in the city of Rome, treating many people, from the enslaved to elites, building a reputation as a highly skilled healer. He worked in varying capacities as physician and pharmacist to 3 emperors, Marcus Aurelius, his son Commodus, and the latter's successor, Septimius Severus. It was during the reign of Commodus, in the year 192, by this point Galen was in his early 60s, that a fire broke out in Rome, burning for days and leaving a path of enormous destruction. We know of this fire from other sources, including Cassius Dio and Herodian, and we also know of it from Galen. In fact, he mentions it in several of his texts. But his most detailed description occurs in the recently rediscovered treatise, Perialupias. Now, the title, Perialupias, had been known for a long time because Galen mentions it elsewhere. Galen wrote books about his own books. I'm not even joking. So he mentions it elsewhere, and quotations from it had been excerpted in Arabic and Hebrew. But the complete Greek text, thought to have been lost for good, was rediscovered as recently as 2005. That's fewer than 20 years ago. Less time than Grey's Anatomy has been on television. So I would just say that we here in Coates and Hall are so accustomed to hearing about archaeological discoveries that it can be delightful and surprising to remember that ancient texts, too, are sometimes recovered. This text was found by chance. Here's what happened as I understand it. A graduate student from France, let me say that again, a graduate student, by the name of Antoine Pietrobelli, came across evidence for the text in the library of a monastery in Thessaloniki. This is the Vlatidon Monastery. He was there to consult a manuscript of another text of Galen, but as any good graduate student does, he took the opportunity to look through some other things, including a rather obscure catalog of some of the monastery's holdings. This was a catalog compiled in the early 20th century that included mainly patristic texts. So scholars of the history of medicine hadn't paid it much attention. There, amid the patristic texts, he saw listed an entry for a medical manuscript dating to the 15th century. It was briefly described in the catalog as containing some texts of Galen, including, lo and behold, Perialupias. Now, Pietro Belli, again, he was a graduate student at the time. He reported this information to his advisor, Véronique Boudon-Millot, who's an eminent scholar of Galen. She then went to visit the monastery to see the manuscript. But really what she was given access to was microfilm of the manuscript. And it's pretty amazing to me that using microfilm, she was able to produce the Editio Princeps by 2007 of this treatise. Since then, since 2007, no fewer than 4 critical editions and 8 translations have been produced, as well as 3 edited volumes about this text. This treatise alone has caused quite a stir. Let's find out why. Perialupias is addressed to a friend of Galen's who has asked Galen how it is that he seems not to be suffering distress, the Greek word is lupe, despite having lost much of his property in the massive fire that tore through Rome in 192. Galen's response is a mix of a self-help book, How to Train Oneself to Avoid Distress, and a reflection on the fire. I won't cover the self-help portion tonight. Sorry, Bana. But rather, my interest is in Galen's description of the path of the fire and all that was lost in it. Here's what he says about what he calls the Great Fire. And you can follow it on this map. So it began at the Temple of Peace, moved through buildings along the Via Sacra, and climbed the Palatine Hill, where, in addition to the imperial palaces, the Palatine libraries were located. Galen writes at length about extensive damage to these library collections. According to Galen, the fire destroyed important works of philosophy by Plato, Aristotle, and Theophrastus, critical editions of Homer by Alexandrian scholars, along with noted works by orators, grammarians, and doctors. Some of these texts existed only at this library. There were no copies, Galen tells us. This was a great loss to Galen, who used the Palatine libraries for research and to make copies of some works for his own use. And if you want to understand book culture, including libraries in the 2nd century, Galen is a very good place to go. Even just in this treatise alone, he mentions other library collections, such as within the Temple of Peace and the House of Tiberius. As I say, Galen used the Palatine libraries to make copies of texts. Many of these copies that Galen made were also lost in the fire, and here's why. Galen had been renting space in a storeroom or warehouse. The word he uses for this larger building in Greek is apotheke. And this building, he says, was along the Via Sacra. Here, Galen had been storing books and other materials related to his medical practice. He says that he chose this particular warehouse because he thought it was fireproof. The only wooden components of the buildings were doors, and it did not stand next to a private residence, which was a notorious source of fires in Rome. He also chose this building because it had a military guard, the reason being that records of some imperial officials were stored there. This apotheke felt like a safe bet, yet still the fire burned, destroying Galen's property. We do not know the exact location of Galen's storeroom, but if we zoom in on this map by Tucci, you can see circled here a couple of other warehouses. And we think this area near the Temple of Peace, which you can see just north of the circled warehouses, is probably the right area for it. The Latin word for warehouse is horea, and you see here the horea piperataria, the pepper or spice warehouse, and the horea named for the Emperor Vespasian. And these two warehouses flank the Via Sacra, and as I've said, Galen's warehouse stood on the same road. There are some scholars who think that his apotheke was either the Piperitaria, well, probably the Piperitaria warehouse, but there's really not conclusive evidence to say for sure. As an aside, I'll also say that one gets a sense from reading Galen in conjunction with reading Perialupius in conjunction with other texts of Galen, that this particular area of Rome was a bustling one for healthcare. Anatomical demonstrations took place outside the Temple of Peace, Galen says. Need cord for suturing? You can pick some up, imported from Gaul, along the Via Sacra. Want to buy a book written by Galen or another doctor? Head to the Sandalarius, the neighborhood labeled in the upper right portion of the screen. Galen's writings bring this neighborhood to life. One begins to imagine the sights, the sounds, the smells. I imagine the redolence of the spices in the air. I grew up in Baltimore, which, when I was a kid, had the McCormick Spice Factory was at the Inner Harbor, and you'd go to the Inner Harbor and you could often smell the cinnamon and other spices in the air. To return now to Galen's description of his apotheke. What you see on the slide is an abbreviated inventory of property Galen lost in the fire, in the order in which he mentions it. I'll read through this list and annotate as we go with some of Galen's discussion from Perialupius. He lost things like silver and gold, silver plate, and loan documents. He lost drugs. He specifies he lost a huge amount of all sorts, and that the drugs were both simple and compound. He lost medical instruments of every kind, some of his own invention. Indeed, he tells us that the fire consumed wax molds for instruments that he himself had designed. He would give these molds to bronzesmiths for casting. He laments the loss of the wax molds, saying that it would take much time and effort to replace them. He lost books that he himself had written, mainly on medical theory and practice. I'm sorry, not mainly, but many on medical theory and practice, as well as books by other authors, as we've heard, and books that he not only copied, but corrected from these other authors. And when he's talking about correcting, what he specifies is correcting scribal errors in those texts. He talks also about the importance of punctuation to render texts more easily understandable. And if you want to know about punctuation in the 2nd century, Galen's a good place to go. I mean, he mentions various types of punctuation in Perialupius, the comma, the double lines, the coronus. There's a lot to learn from Galen. He lost antidotes, specifically theriac, some 80 pounds of it, cinnamon, more than a person could find in all the shops put together, he says, and a large quantity of unspecified rare drugs. Here, I'm going to digress briefly from Perialupius to talk about these antidotes and highlight the lengths, including physical distances, to which Galen and others went to acquire them. Galen says that he lost 6 varieties of cinnamon in the fire. Cinnamon was a common ingredient in the first antidote that Galen mentions, theriac, which is a panacea developed originally as an antidote to poison. The word theriac comes from the Greek word ther, which means a wild beast. We see it in the English word panther, an entirely wild creature, apparently. Multiple recipes for theriac survive from antiquity, compounded from dozens of ingredients that included residues of wild beasts. Viper's flesh was the most popular, as well as mineral and botanical substances like cinnamon, imported, Galen tells us, all the way from India. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius ingested theriac daily, and Galen had the job of compounding theriac for Septimius Severus. One historian of ancient medicine, Laurence Totolin, has traced the ingredients used in theriac, many of them coming from the far reaches of the Roman Empire and beyond. As she puts it eloquently, the emperor ingested the world in a pill. Another way to think about theriac is as a microcosm of travel and trade in medicinal substances, substances stockpiled in both imperial warehouses and personal collections. Nor, I assure you, was Galen's the only personal collection of materia medica. It was certainly I imagine it was one of the most extensive personal or private collections, but it wasn't the only one. The last item that Galen mentions having lost are compilations of recipes for compounded drugs, so recipe books, essentially. He specifies that these were written on parchment, diphtheri, probably in codex form, and thus more akin to a book as we know it than a papyrus roll. And it is interesting to think about how medical knowledge may have driven innovations in book technology. Vivian Nutton, another huge scholar of ancient medicine, has written about this and has noted that one of the earliest detailed tables of contents that we have is from a book of remedies by Scribonius Largus. And that table of contents, much like a codex form of a book, would enable you to find a recipe much more easily than to roll and unroll a scroll. Galen tells us that his collection of recipe books was more wondrous than any other, including, as it did, a book by another physician who had traveled extensively throughout almost the whole world to gather the recipes. He says, "Skedon ex oles tes oikumenes." So this person had done extensive travel to collect the recipes. Galen mentions, too, that physicians would sometimes trade drug recipes. All this yet another instance of an exchange of medical knowledge and the travel sometimes required to obtain it. As you can see, from this list alone, much of what Galen lost in the fire, as he reports it, was medical. Books about the theory and practice of medicine, recipe books, instruments, and a whole lot of drugs. The link between the English word apothecary and the Greek word apotheke is perhaps nowhere more vivid than in Galen's account. Moreover, with the possible exception of the medical instruments, all of these items, as Galen describes them, are demonstrative of a robust exchange. Ideas moved, drugs moved, people moved. The guy who collected recipes traveled, Galen traveled. It's kind of astounding. Before the rediscovery of Perialupias, we knew in rather broad brushstrokes about some of this material, but we did not know nearly as much about the library collections Galen used and how he made use of them, of the recipe books that he and others had collected, or of all the drugs and instruments that he had stored along the Via Sacra. Perialupias lifts the curtain on the traffic in both medical knowledge and materia medica, as few other sources do. Well, what I'd like to do now in the last part of my talk is move beyond Perialupias to take you on 2 detours, with Galen as our guide, to look at 2 other substances he used in his medical practice. These he encountered on a trip to the Roman province of Syria. We're not sure when in his lifetime Galen made this trip, but certainly before the fire, and well before the fire, that much we know. But one purpose of the journey, in any case, was to investigate, evaluate, and collect medicinal substances. He talks about this trip in other treatises, primarily on antidotes and on the mixtures and powers of simple drugs, should you wish to read more. Well, let's join Galen as he makes his way north within the province of Syria. Here, he encounters a caravan coming from India. The caravan's many camels are loaded down with botanicals, including one called Lycion. Dioscorides, Pliny, and Galen write about this plant. Many people in antiquity wrote about this plant. The best variety, everyone agreed, grew in India and was perhaps a form of barberry. And I should say here that it's sometimes very difficult to map these ancient plant names onto modern plants. It's even hard sometimes in the modern period to map one plant name onto a plant in a different region. And I'm no botanist, for sure. So I say all that just to let you know at the outset here. Lycion, or the extract of Lycion, whether from India or elsewhere, was said to be effective against a host of ailments, including runny, itchy eyes, ears, oozing pus, ulcerated gums, chapped lips, putrefying sores, jaundice, and much more. It was also an antidote to poison and a hair dye. Color? Blonde. There, in Syria, Galen stood, interrogating the caravan's owner about the purity of the Lycion he was transporting. Galen remarks in several of his writings about the risk of buying adulterated products. He advises others to inspect drugs not just once or twice, but many times. Finally, Galen is convinced of the purity of this Lycion and purchases a large quantity, enough, he says, to last a lifetime. I believe it's entirely possible that some of this Lycion from India ended up in Galen's Apotheke as one of his so-called rare drugs. Unless we think the use of Lycion is some odd practice of the ancients, Lycion from India was still used well into the 19th century, especially for inflammation and infection of the eyes. While the best type of Lycion was from India, there was another type that grew in the region of Lycia, hence the name Lycion, and Cappadocia in Asia Minor, as well as on Mount Pelion in Greece. This variety was perhaps a box thorn, which you can see here in the stunningly illustrated edition of John Sibthorpe's Flora Graeca that is here in the Gennadius Library. I want to thank Maria Yorgopoulou for bringing this work to my attention, and it really is absolutely amazing. There are 10 volumes. Each volume contains almost 100 of these full-page illustrations by Ferdinand Bauer. And these are large volumes. I don't know if you can tell in the slide on the right how big these volumes are. They're roughly 11, each page is roughly 11 by 17. So these are very big books. And I think it's exciting to think about all the works of natural history that Ioannis Gennadius collected. And I wonder if he was inspired in some ways by his brother, Panayotis Gennadius, who was a botanist. And we have, of course, one of his works in the Gennadius Library, too, or maybe we have more than one of his works. And this lexicon also includes an entry on Lycion, of course. All right, well, Lycion extract, which we heard was used for many different kinds of ailments, was very popular across the Mediterranean in antiquity, which we know not just from these medical writings, but also from the archaeological record. Medicine bottles inscribed with the word Lycion have been located as far afield as Sicily and southern Italy, Crimea, the Levant, Asia Minor, the Cyclades, and right here in Athens. Here are two examples from the Agora, made of lead, with the word Lycion and a personal name, probably that of the individual who compounded or sold the drug. There are also symbols. There's a plant on the one on the top. I wonder if it might be Lycion. I don't know. And a tripod on the one on the bottom. You know, we can only speculate about some of these symbols and what they signify. It's possible that the tripod points to Apollo, who was a healing god, somehow lending the drug greater efficacy. It's interesting that we have other lead medicine bottles. There's one, for instance, in the British Museum that has a different personal name on it, but also has a tripod on it. Here are two more examples from the Agora, these in terracotta, one associated with a certain Nicias from Lycia, if I'm interpreting Lykios here correctly as an adjective modifying Nicias. Other scholars have understood this as an alternate spelling or misspelling of Lycion. I don't think there's much doubt in either case that this was a Lycion bottle. The other bottle, or what we have as a fragment of it at the bottom, it's very difficult for me to read the stamp. I had a lot of trouble reading it, so I'm relying on earlier readings of it. But again, we have the word Lycion associated with a certain Hermophilus. Now, many of you here at the American School are familiar with the work of Dr. Virginia Grace, who studied stamped amphora handles. She also studied these bottles and identified the fabric of both as from the island of Rhodes, which means that we have yet more evidence for trade. Not only was the drug imported, but so too were the containers. And I want to thank Dr. Natalia Vokekhoff-Brogan for bringing these bottles to my attention. There's a scholar, Luigi Tabarelli, who has done a lot of work on these medicine bottles, and he had been using the archives here at the American School to read Virginia Grace's correspondence about them, and it was Natalia who brought them to my attention. Now, if we put these objects from the Athenian Agora side by side, well, they're here side by side, the four bottles I've just shown you. If we put those into conversation with Galen's experiences about Lycion, two things become clear. First, there was a robust trade in Lycion well before Galen that we can track around the Mediterranean via these medicine bottles. Some of the Lycian bottles have been dated as early as the 4th century, not these from the Agora, but other ones. That's some 500 years before Galen. Second, someone besides Galen was worried about the authenticity of Lycian. If we return to these two terracotta examples, they are stamped ep ngui or ep ngue, which means guaranteed. I don't know how effective that stamp would have been in preventing adulteration, but maybe it put the buyer's mind to rest. Okay, so we're going to leave Lycian behind now to join Galen farther north along his route. He stops at Cyprus, an island outstanding for all sorts of information about ancient medicine. But one of the most remarkable pieces of data comes from Galen's visit there. He mentions going to Soli on the north part of the island to visit copper mines. Why, you might wonder, would a physician care about copper? Many byproducts of copper were used in healthcare. I mean, a lot of byproducts of copper. And I show you here, by way of example, another bit of medical spectacle. A marble plaque from a house in Herculaneum. This illustrates Achilles healing a king named Telephus, whom he had wounded on his way to Troy. The wound was not healing, and an oracle told Telephus that he needed the one who injured him to cure him. And here we see Achilles scraping bits of the bronze spearhead, of his own bronze spearhead, onto the wound. It turns out that copper, a key component of bronze, has antimicrobial properties. It kills bacteria. So the kind of thing Achilles is doing may well have been an effective treatment. All right, back to Cyprus. At Soli, Galen toured a huge copper mining operation run by the Roman imperial government. He investigated 7 byproducts of these mines and describes how they were produced. He also describes the conditions of the mines, their engineering, how the shafts and galleries were formed and their size, also the challenging and hazardous work done by a large, enslaved labor force. In one mine, the laborers worked naked, in air thick with suffocating odors, with little light. The lamps would extinguish frequently. You know what I'm going to say. If you want to learn about mining conditions, Galen's a pretty good place to go. Here again, we see Galen investigating by autopsy, asking questions, gathering knowledge, collecting substances. He shipped off a large quantity of copper and other minerals, even presenting some to friends in Asia and Italy, who deemed it the greatest gift, according to Galen. All right, since this is the American School of Classical Studies, I'm going to leave you with a coda about the impact of these mines near Soli, not on healthcare, but on education in the United States. In 1916, a U.S. company known as the Cyprus Mines Corporation reopened mines near Soli. Their prospector had been drawn to the area because of ancient accounts of copper mining, though apparently he was unaware of Galen's detailed description. Oh, for the love of Galen. These texts were out there. This was not Periale PS. I mention this, though, because I think it's fascinating. Galen, I've just told you earlier, 1/10 of Greek literature from Homer through the end of the 2nd century is Galen. How many people read Galen? Well, in the 19th century, who was reading Galen? It was mainly physicians. So a lot of other people weren't really aware much of his writings. So I can understand why the prospector wasn't aware of them. Anyhow, the Cyprus Mines Corporation would become hugely profitable, operating mines there until the 1970s, and I believe they are still in operation. A different company is running them now. In any case, one of the founders of the Cyprus Mines Corporation was a man named Harvey Seeley Mudd, and profits from the mines in Cyprus helped to finance the eponymous Harvey Mudd College, a liberal arts college in California with an equal focus on humanities and sciences. And I can only imagine that Galen would be thrilled. He wrote a treatise entitled "The Best Doctor is Also a Philosopher," which is a tour de force defense of the humanities by a famous physician that I encourage you to wave in the face of any dean or provost who threatens to cut back humanities at your institution. It's really wonderful. Okay, well, our journey this evening is drawing to an end. And we spent a lot of time with one person, Galen. It's important to recognize that Galen was not a typical healthcare provider. He was a man of great status, wealth, and privilege, and he had access to opportunities that most practitioners did not, including the ability to purchase many rare drugs, to learn from the best teachers, to acquire an extensive collection of medical texts, and to travel as easily and as far as he did. And to be sure, most of Galen's work was facilitated by his own labor force, many of whom were enslaved individuals. And I've shown you these other images from a medieval manuscript of Galen, and I just use them to say, perhaps here, the image on the right is a bit closer to reality. Galen was not a self-sufficient monk-like scholar. He did not travel by himself. He would have had a whole entourage with him as he made these trips. I've also been reading recently Daniel Padilla Peralta's article on epistemicide, and I'm really drawn to his discussion of floating fragments of the knowledge of other people and just the floating fragments that you can find in Galen of all the enslaved labor that went into his work. Nonetheless, it is astounding to me how just one text, rediscovered through the kind of travel and autopsy that Galen himself favored, can shift in subtle ways how we understand ancient healthcare practices. These practices relied on a great deal of movement, not only of people looking for cures, like Diogenianos, with whom we began this evening, but of those who provided therapy, and of the traffic in materials and knowledge that such therapy often required. Moreover, I hope that some of the evidence I have shared this evening, such as the medicine bottles from the Agora and the grave marker of the physician Socrates, demonstrate that elites like Galen were not the only ones engaged in these practices. At many levels, healthcare relied on networks of exchange that ran deep and wide, sometimes more visible, sometimes less, then as also now. Indeed, in our world today, an enormous amount of movement undergirds healthcare practices, more so than many of us typically attend to, and far beyond medical tourism, strictly construed. To put this another way, much as we can locate in the Greek and Roman past precedent for some modern ideas and even methods of healing, so too can we identify in that same past movement as a significant factor in healthcare. There's perhaps no more fitting way for me to conclude this talk than to bid you all Yassas, a phrase that you know well, and to remind you that this means literally to your health. So Yassas and thank you.
Bronwen, thank you so much for that wonderful lecture, and I'd like now to open the floor to questions that you might have regarding medical tourism or Galen, or on avoiding distress. Jessica, you're in front.
Thank you, Bronwen. That was delightful. I really enjoyed it. And I was wondering if you have seen any sort of temporal concentration of medical tourism in your data. Just thinking about how people discuss the increased mobility and connectivity under the Romans, if you see greater tourism under Rome or anything like that.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I think that the infrastructure that the Roman Empire provided must have facilitated even more movement. But it is striking to me how much movement you see before the Roman Empire. In the Hippocratic tradition, even if you think of the treatise Epidemics, where you have physicians traveling to Thasos to cure, for instance, and there's just a lot of this idea of movement. And I'm even struck in terms of iconography of somebody like Asclepius or other physicians who have walking staffs, and this idea that they're usually itinerant. And like I said, there's just so much information. There's a scholar named Eveline Samama who's collected epigraphic evidence for physicians, and she has a whole section discussing movement of these physicians, and some of it's quite early too. So while I definitely think it increased under the Roman Empire, and it's funny to me too, by the way, that Galen, to come back to Galen, Galen compares his work to the work of Trajan in improving the roads in the Roman Empire. So much as Trajan improved things, Galen improves them medically, I guess. But yes, and there is, so I'm not entirely the first person, I think, to raise the question of medical tourism in the ancient world. I'm certainly not the first person. There's a scholar whose last name is Israelovich who's looked at medical tourism. He has a section on that in his book on Roman medicine, and is talking about the very thing that you're bringing up, this increased infrastructure and the like. So that is out there. I will just say, as a little footnote to that, is what I think that I'm doing that's a little different is looking not just at patients moving, and a lot of people have looked at practitioners moving, but also what else is moving around. And so that was a very long answer to say, yes, in the Roman Empire, I think you're seeing increased movement, but it was there earlier too. Yeah.
Thank you, Bronwen. That was fascinating. I learned so much. When you were talking about the medicine bottles that have the tripod on them,
Yeah.
I had a thought, and I'll tell you, and I want you to think or tell me if you have thought the same thing. So here in Athens, there's Tripodon Street on the east side of the Acropolis that was famous in antiquity for having those tripods on them. And I was wondering if the medicine bottle with that symbol might have been an address of sorts, because that was the earliest named street in the ancient world. And so anyway, that was my thought when I saw the tripod, that same symbol on the medicine bottle. Maybe it was telling people, find this medicine here, acquire it there.
Possibly. I think it's very hard to know. The two bottles, the lead bottles that were found in the Agora, there was a third one with it, a third lead bottle with it. I'll say it was in a fill of a great drain, so I don't know that we can say much about where these were originally located. But there were 3 of these little lead bottles. There are other bottles that are said to be from Athens in the British Museum, and there's one in the Benaki Museum, which I have permission to see next week. I'm very excited. And I think that there were merchants, there were pharmacists, whoever it was who was handing out these bottles, probably in various parts of the city. I like the idea. I'm not sure if we could, know for certain whether that's what it signified, but I like the idea. Maybe it's an advertisement. Maybe you know where to go back to get your next dose or something like that. People have also commented on the size of these bottles. They're little. There's one of the, I can go back if you like, if you don't mind me flipping through sides. What do we think about that? We're okay? I'm just going to flip. Well, you can close your eyes. There's one of the bottles, the capacity, here, good, we're not too far back. The capacity of one of the bottles is listed. It was on the Agora had this data. It's the one on the bottom. It says, you can see the capacity there. But these are, that's 2 centimeters tall. These are tiny little bottles. I think the terracotta ones hold even less. I don't know their exact capacities. In fact, I put the image that I took of the inside of this medicine bottle on the right. I could just put my little pinky finger in that impression on the inside. That's how big it is. There's just not much space there. So are these just 1 dose kinds of medicine bottles? All these are fantastic questions, and I like your idea a lot, and I love having more ways to think about the iconography there. So thank you for that.
Victoria?
Thanks, Bronwen. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm curious about, with these physicians traveling around, and I guess my own knowledge of modern medical practices and my own doctor, I have quite a personal relationship and trust built into that relationship. So I'm curious, with all of these like moving around parts and individuals, how do you imagine the physicians might have inspired trust in their patients, or is that a process at all a part of antiquities practice?
That's a lovely question, and I think a really important question that probably deserves a lot more consideration. I can tell you that I guess a couple things are coming to mind. When we see physicians, I'm going to start maybe in the Greek period and then I'll go to the Roman period. I've been paying more and more attention to Athenian comedy and how doctors are represented there. And it's interesting that, in Menander's Aspis, and Olga Palia brought this information to my attention, which I thought was lovely. But in Menander's Aspis, there's need for a physician, and they want a physician who seems really to know their stuff really well. So it's like, where can we get a foreign physician? And they don't know where to get one, so they say, where can we get someone we can dress up and this guy can pretend, give enough of and it's a Doric dialect that he ends up using, which is also very interesting. And then there are these other fragments too, like the doctor from southern Italy or something like that, that is thought to have a little bit more authority, perhaps. And I find this I'm thinking about it now, finding more evidence for it, that the idea of a foreign physician is somehow, or like from outside your hometown, seems to have a little more cachet for whatever reason. Now, what does that mean for your question? I don't know. Is that person resident in that city for a little while? Do they come and go? It seems, for instance, on Phasos, where we have, the evidence of Hippocrates' epidemics, that there were multiple physicians coming through and leaving case notes, or whatever we want to call those. So I'm not sure. And again, not every physician traveled, so there probably would be maybe, I would think, a possibility of varying degrees, like maybe you start with your local physician, and maybe then if they can't heal you, you hope to get the foreigner who comes in, and then you go to the healing god. I'm not sure. I was going to say, though, with Galen, if we move into the Roman period, Galen did have some pretty personal relationships, meaning ongoing relationships with some of his patients. But of course, what we hear about are these elites, in Rome who have a lot of money, and they're kind of hangers-on. Galen actually says he can't stand that, but that's what they do. That's kind of part of the performance of being a Roman elite. So I think that there were varieties of this, but I thank you for bringing that question up, because I want to give it a lot more thought. I appreciate that.
Thanks very much. It was fascinating. I have a question regarding, are there any evidence for psychedelic drugs, or places that you go for hallucination, or to cure madness? People would travel for that, anything like that?
I'm laughing only because I have a thought about imbalances. So let me start with the psychedelic drug. I'm not sure. The one thing that, it's not a psychedelic drug, right, that I can think of, though, that is a pretty powerful drug is opium, right? But that's not psychedelic, technically, I believe. I don't know of psychedelic drugs, although they might have had access to them. But as to people traveling for kind of help with their mental health, is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
I happen to have co-authored a book about Epidauros, where we think, and Chris Kanellopoulos, I think, is he here tonight? Anyhow, is that we think that music, and there are others who think that there is music that is used to perhaps help people rebalance, kind of bring balance to their mental health. Galen talks about music in this regard, not necessarily in sanctuaries, but he talks about music. He talks about people writing music or writing poetry for healthcare. So there are ways in which I think we get at what we would call today maybe art as therapy, right? And we see actually, I think we're finding more and more evidence for that. So I think that these musical performances in some of these sanctuaries had a therapeutic effect, and it wasn't just on the physical body, is my supposition. So, yeah. But as far as a drug that does it, I'm not sure.
You mentioned Epidaurus, but this was wasn't that a very highly organized medical center that people came to? I mean, that must have been one of the first centers of medical tourism.
Yes, it was a very important one, a very early one in terms of worship of Asclepius, and the excavators are finding more and more evidence that is pushing that date even earlier, perhaps into the 7th century, 6th century, for worship at Epidaurus. And yes, as time goes by, that sanctuary has a huge and enormous infrastructure. There's a big building program in the 4th century BCE with all sorts of facilities there. We have inscriptions of people who travel to Epidaurus for healing, and there were competitions there, athletic competitions, rhapsodic competitions, and so on. So a lot of things happening there, and a lot around healing. And it was certainly, I'd say, sort of an epicenter of medical healing, and certainly of Asclepius cult.
I think I see Connor's hand up, and then we also have some, afterwards me.
I was thinking about your lead bottles of medicine, but lead itself is slightly poisonous, I think.
Yes. And again, there's lots of ways we can think about, I don't think they were aware of that. There's lead that's used in other therapies in antiquity. Some therapies recommend that you boil things up in a lead pot, for instance. Something called white lead was used quite often. So lead was used, and they didn't realize the dangers of it. So there's an irony here. And I do wonder maybe, how does that lithium react with the lead, or what happens if you take lithium that's in a terracotta pot versus in a lead pot? I'd love to know what the difference was.
I would too.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bronwen. I was wondering, so this is a question about the status of doctors and partially following back up on the chronological question that you guys were speaking about a moment ago. In the Hellenistic period, doctors seem to be meaningfully conceived of as representatives, in a sense, of their home polis, even when they are working abroad. Mm-hmm. This can be seen very clearly, I think, in the epigraphic evidence, because often the way that we know about these individuals is honors being sent back to their home city from wherever they've taken up residency as a doctor. I think that this is really interesting for the status question, because it seems to be a bit different from this idea of doctors as these almost stateless, itinerant wanderers that partially from a position of ignorance I get off of other periods of history. But sort of to loop this back into an actual question for the end, I'm curious about how this perhaps exceptional status position of the Hellenistic period follows into Galen's own day. Is Galen still, as a doctor working abroad, meaningfully as a still meaningfully a man of Pergamon, or is he somebody at this point who can be, a man of the Oikomene, a man of the Roman Empire? Is he still tied into his homeland as a doctor? Is that part of being a doctor? Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that question. Once Galen gets to Rome, he's largely in Rome, and he's largely, I think, at least as he presents it, kind of at the mercy of the emperors, once he builds up this reputation. He does leave Rome. There's some question about why and when and whether it has to do with the Antonine Plague, and he goes back to Pergamon for a period and then gets recalled to Aquileia in northern Italy to help with the troops there. Marcus Aurelius is fighting on the front up there. He spends about a year there and then goes to Rome and spends really most of his life in Rome. So I think that he might be the physician of the Oikomene in the sense that he's serving the emperors. But he, in terms of his identity, I think you're raising a fascinating question, Connor, which is, and I hadn't paid attention to this, and thank you for bringing it up, that even as much as these physicians traveled, many of them are identified by their hometown. And Galen, I think, would always consider himself a Pergamene in a lot of ways. Culturally, I think he thought of himself very much as a Greek. He always wrote in Greek. And so it is worth, I think, also saying that in the Roman period, the evidence we have for a lot of physicians is that they are not, many of them are foreigners in the Roman period. And what of the epigraphic evidence that I'm aware of, it's much as you say, though, they will, like Socrates even says, I'm from Nicaea, right? That they identify their home land, if not their home polis. So, yeah, and it's there earlier. It's certainly there before the Hellenistic period, as I'm sure you're aware, that we see physicians who are tied to a location or they come from a certain place. And I'm thinking even of the grave stele of Phanostrate, a woman who is an iatros and a Maya, a midwife. And it's hard to, the inscription doesn't survive well, but there's some question about it. It seems that there is maybe either a demotic, if we can say that. So this was found in a Carni, but is she from the deme Melite? We can see the mu and maybe the next, maybe an epsilon after it. But others have wondered then if, Rebecca Kennedy has wondered, is she from the island of Milos or from Miletus or something farther afield? But there seems to be some attempt to give where she comes from, right? Even if it's only going from the deme Melite to a Carni. So I think I want to give that more thought, and I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I think the idea of a hometown is still very important in some ways for these physicians, even as they make their way around the Roman Empire.
I think we've got three excellent questions online, so if I could turn to the first one, which is from two members of your seminar, Steph Savage and Sammy Richter, who write, "Thank you so much, Bronwen, for this wonderful talk, as always. You're awesome. Thinking about Lemnian soil and the special Lycian terracotta bottles, to what extent is the potency or effectiveness of materia medica, particularly ones that need to travel far distances, determined or dependent on the rituals associated in their gathering or creation and their later usage? And could these rituals be examples of spectacle themselves?"
Oh, I like that. Oh, it comes full circle. I will say that with Lycian, I'm not sure if there are what we would call religious rituals used in harvesting that particular botanical. There were with Lemnian soil. Galen, Dioscorides, well, Galen really is the one who describes going to Lemnos. By the way, if you want to know how to get to Lemnos and not get lost, read Galen. He gives you an exact itinerary because he managed to go to the wrong city on Lemnos the first time he tried. And he talks about a ritual in which a priestess of Artemis harvested the soil. She kind of washed the soil, wheeled it into town, formed it into these roundels, stamped them, and they dried out. So I'm not sure that we have, with all these botanicals, that they were always harvested by a priestess or something like that, as we have with Lemnian soil. I definitely think, though, with Lemnian soil, that those rituals are a big part of their perceived efficacy. And I think that it's fascinating that the Christian tradition picks this up with Lemnian soil and continues to harvest it. And it continues, I think, to have this efficacy. I mean, it was one of the there were many medicinal soils in antiquity, but Lemnian soil was one of the best known and thought to be the most efficacious. And so, yes, I think that's very much the case. The other thing I thought maybe Sammy and Steph were asking, and I'll just mention this as a side note, is a lot of scholars wonder about how these drugs were transported, in what kinds of containers, how long would they have kept their efficacy, and that's a big question. We hear little snippets in some of these authors about different kinds of containers to transport, and I doubt that medicine like this Lycian was transported in these little bottles. I would think that they would have been transported in larger containers, particularly with the terracotta, because there's seepage that happens. How much Lycian would be left by the time you got it back into Athens? I don't know. So To return, though, to Steph and Sammy's question, yeah, I think that the religious rituals are really important. And there's this, I'm using a term here that another scholar has used with referring to another bit of materia medica, but I think that there's a sense of a terroir with Lemnian soil, that soil is thought to be efficacious because of all the mythological traditions on Lemnos around healing and because of the religious rituals.
Let me keep going, because there are additional good questions here from Christina Samorkas. Does Galen comment on women traveling to religious or sacred sites to pray for having a child or safe childbirth, one of the oldest forms of medical tourism?
It is one of the oldest forms of medical tourism. I can't think of an example that Galen gives of a woman doing that. But there's certainly loads of evidence, as this person who's asking this question must know well, right? That there is a huge evidence about this, and Asclepius is one of those places that people go to, at least around questions of fertility or difficult childbirths. But I'm not aware of any specific instance in Galen.
Excellent. And just two more questions, and then we'll adjourn. Richard Fisher writes, thank you, Bronwen. Have you come across evidence that plague episodes influenced either medical tourism, afflicted seeking cures, or the movement of pharmacia, or medical practitioners trying to combat epidemics or inform themselves about best practices?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, Galen talks about treating a lot of plague victims in the Antonine Plague. He was in Aquileia when the plague reached Italy, and one of the theories is it came back with the army from the east, and he was there on the front lines of the epidemic as well as of the battle front for, like I said, about a year, and then he leaves and goes to Rome. Where he's still treating people. He talks about how long that plague was, the lingering effects of it. The way that somebody like Galen, and I think what we get of what we can tell out of, say, Thucydides' account of the plague in Athens, is that when physicians are thinking about it, they're thinking about it in the ways that, there are lots of people who think that these plagues are religious, right? That they're brought on by the gods in some way. But there are healers who think about it through their own view of health. And for someone like Galen, he thinks it's a humoral imbalance, and he thinks you have too much black bile if you're suffering from the plague. And part of that is he's seeing what people are excreting who have the plague. So he does talk about some cures that he thinks are efficacious that are really a little bit strange, like, and I might be getting this wrong, but like milk from animals in stabii, or urine of a particular boy. So there is a sense in which maybe they're going somewhere else to look for some of these cures. And I'm also trying to think about, I think the thing about tourism and plague that strikes me too is the way that plagues move, right? Apart from people moving, but they often move through movements of individuals or the Roman army or that kind of thing as well. I'm not sure I've answered that question, but it's giving me something to think about too.
And just a final question from Kathleen Warner-Slane, who says, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I'm thinking that both the terracotta ointment jars and the lead ones must have been sealed during the manufacturing process rather than when they were filled. So they're not exactly analogs of our modern pill containers. Do you have any thoughts on this? And then guarantee from producer, question mark?
Okay, so again, the idea here is they would have been sealed. Was it when they were produced?
It says during the manufacturing process rather than when they were filled.
Okay, I'm a little confused. So during the manufacturing process rather than when they were filled, they would have been sealed? I'm trying to figure out how they get the medicine in it.
This one we might be able to take offline and ask her more specifically.
I would love to follow up about that.
Okay. Fine. Well, then at this stage, I think we should all regard wine as a medicinal substance and partake to our health. Thank you so much, Bronwen.
Thank you.